The Hebrew Bible reading for today from the lectionary comes from Exodus chapter 20, and it starts at verse 1. And if you want to read along in the very tiny print of your pew Bible, you'll find it on page 66. Listen now and see if you hear some word from the Lord. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth below, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or your female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your mother and father, so that your days may be long in the land of the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin." Then the people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. This is a word from the Lord. Pray with me, please. God, I ask that the meditation of my mind and the words of my lips would be holy and acceptable to you this day and be for us a word. Amen. The lectionary text actually didn't pull out all of those verses. They were going to have me read a smattering, but I don't think we should read things out of context. So I've read it all to you. But it's worth noting that probably in its original form, when these things were carved into tablets and not written on papyrus, the list might have been a little more brief, right? No one's sitting around writing all this into a tablet. But once we have papyrus forms, you can get a little more commentary in there. The 10 Commandments that we read today appear twice in the Bible, and this is the second version. And in it, it starts with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. That's a different translation than the one we just read, but I think it's a better one. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. That's how God sets up these 10 commandments. Most likely in their early tablet form, before the extra commentary, it would have been a briefer list, still 10, but it would have said, no gods before me, no carved likenesses, don't take my name in vain, remember the Sabbath and hallow it, honor father and mother, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness against fellow man, and do not covet. Pretty simple, right? That's why we all do it perfectly every day. Oh, wait. The wisdom of the world that the people in Jesus's time, the Greeks that we heard about, that Zoe so beautifully read, the wisdom of the world tells us that we should do whatever it takes to get ahead. We should work hard, never take a day off, hustle, right? I'm a millennial, and people describe millennials as having lived and grown up in hustle culture. Does anyone know what hustle culture is? No. Okay, well, maybe the 3 millennials. It's this idea that we should always be working on a side gig, right? Always kind of be hustling at different projects and things where we might make a buck, because people my age generally aren't going to stay in their factory job or their corporate job for 47 years and then get a gold watch, right? But I think hustle culture describes this idea we all have of the wisdom of the world tells us, keep on hustling, keep on working so you can get ahead. The wisdom of the world tells us it's important for us to strike out on our own and gain independence from our families or our parents or whoever came before us so that we can make it. The wisdom of our world tells us that our first job is to protect ourselves and our families, and that we should take whatever we can get. The wisdom of the world tells us that the goal of life is to have the best and the most and the prettiest. We're told that we have to do whatever it takes to get ahead. Literally think about that phrase, do whatever it takes. The phrase itself encourages taking, right? The wisdom of our world tells us we've got to hustle and keep up with the Joneses. But the wisdom of our God says that is foolish. The wisdom of our God reminds us that God has brought us through life thus far, that God brought the Israelites out of slavery, brought down the 10 plagues, parted the Red Sea, brought manna into the desert. The wisdom of our God reminds us in this story that God has brought the Israelites thus far, and that therefore they don't need to worry about hustling or getting ahead or worrying about protecting themselves and their family or taking whatever they can get. God has brought them thus far and has shown them that God will provide, even in the crummiest situations, right? And that's how these 10 commandments start. I, the Lord your God, brought you out of that horror show, made sure you were protected. I have provided for you thus far. I've brought you out of the land of slavery. Here's what I want you to do. When we trust that God will continue to provide, when we remember that God has provided and we believe in God's providence, when we believe that God will continue to provide, when we remember that God brought the Israelites out of slavery and has brought us out of some difficult stuff, right? Just look at your lives. I'm sure you've all been brought out of some terrifying or challenging times. When we remember that, then we can trust that God will continue to provide. And when we remember that God has brought us thus far, it frees us up from the worry and anxiety about the need to keep working and taking and hoarding and coveting and hustling. When we believe that God has brought us thus far, when we remember that, and when we believe that God will continue to take us through life, we are able to let go of our need to covet and steal and murder and take and acquire and amass, right? We can be freed from our need to keep on working and making false idols out of stuff that will not actually bring us through hard times. When we remember that God has brought us thus far, and when we remember that God has promised to provide for tomorrow, we can follow these commandments, actually. At least a little better than when we forget, because we don't have to worry as much about taking as much as we can get. Gratitude for God's provision leads to a rejection of the world's wisdom. It leads to a life where we can share with one another, where we can honor our commitments and our contracts, and where we can respect human life. I want you to think about some of the places and spaces where we break these commandments. Murder's easy. Close your eyes, think about murder. When does murder happen? It's okay actually to shout out. I know we're Presbyterian, but it'll be okay. When there's hate, usually when there's fear. If you turn on the news, you're going to hear stories about murder, right? Where do those happen? They happen in drug deals a lot, right? Like, get on the wrong side of a drug deal. Sometimes there's some murder involved, right? They happen in war. They happen when we invade other countries, or when we go to take stuff that we want that we don't have, right? When we covet what another group has. Murder happens when we worry about needing to provide more for ourselves and usually take it from someone else's self, right? Same thing with coveting. When do we covet? None of you ever covet? When someone else has better stuff. Yeah, I have this fishy backpack. It's really great, but I really want the Louis Vuitton one. I'm not going to get it, right? But I covet it. Looks a lot better than the Orvis one. When we have fear, say more about that. When we're afraid we won't have enough, right? Or we'll run out. We love to stockpile. When else do we covet? I think sometimes when we're insecure about who we are, probably this is part of that adultery deal too, right? When we're worried that we aren't enough, so we need to have something else to prove that we are enough. But when we do these things, it's usually because we've forgotten that our identity does not come from all the stuff. Our identity does not come from having enough or more than enough. Our identity comes from being beloved children of God. Our identity comes from being chosen by God for life and provision. Our identity comes in remembering that God has brought us thus far and God will provide for us. In the world we live in, living out a peace around this, trusting that God will provide, looks foolish. It looks silly, like you need to have more. Come on, guys. Like, what if you need more cans of food and you don't have enough, right? Now, I'm not saying you should live with like only one can of green beans or whatever, because then, if there is a war, I guess we'll have to gather our green beans. But there's a peace that comes from remembering that the God who's chosen us to be God's beloved children has brought us through life thus far, has promised to take us through life until our day's end, and that God will provide. Gratitude for God's provision is what allows us to follow these commandments. We can't do it on our own. Most of us are pretty bad at following these. But if we remember that God has brought us thus far and God will continue to provide for us, it gets a lot easier. Gratitude and remembering that God brought us out of Egypt, God brought us out of the land of slavery, and God will continue to provide, helps us to reject the world's wisdom. And it leads us into a life where we can share with one another, where instead of hoarding, we can give, where we can honor our commitments, and where we can dignify human life. This week, I'm going to invite you to look at those 10 commandments. You can get an abbreviated version if you want. I want you to think about each one. I know there's 10 and there's only 6 days of work in the week, but you could probably get all those covet ones together. Look at those 10 commandments and think about how we do it well, how you do it well, what it looks like when we follow them, and where we mess it up. And see if you can find any patterns or any indications about what it is that leads us to screw it up. My guess is if we remember that the Lord our God brought us out of Egypt and has chosen us as his beloved children and will provide for us tomorrow, we will be freed from some of the need to break those covenants. Amen.